There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. And so now they're down from the mountain because we never live in our mountaintop experiences. We, just like them, we generally live down here in the valley where there's always a lot of chaos going on. And in our gospel here in Matthew, the first thing we see is that there's a father who's kneeling before Jesus and he's pleading for Jesus to have mercy on his son. In this account, it also is written in the Gospels of Mark and Luke. But in Luke and in Mark, they have a lot more details. And we learn that this is this man's only son. And we're also told that before this man came kneeling down before Jesus, that Jesus had just caught up with his other disciples, the other 9, the ones that he left behind, and that there's this crowd around them, and the scribes were arguing with the disciples. But then when the crowd, they recognized Jesus, they all started running toward Jesus. And then Jesus asked those 9 disciples that were left behind, he says, "What are you arguing with the scribes about?" But before the disciples gave Jesus an answer, that's where Matthew's account begins. And this father, he runs to Jesus and he kneels and he pleads with Jesus for his son. And so back in Matthew, it says that the father tells Jesus that his son is an epileptic. And this word here, translated epileptic, is actually the word moonstruck. And that's our word for calling somebody a lunatic, that this son was out of his mind. And then we learned from Mark's gospel, and this is in Mark, that this father describes the son as of having a mute spirit. And then he describes what this mute spirit does to his son. Now, this is where I believe the translators in Matthew decided to pick the word epileptic instead of the word lunatic because of this father's description of this demonic attack. Because what he describes there, it looks like an epileptic attack. Because in Mark, the father says, it seizes him, it throws him down, he foams at the mouth, and he gnashes his teeth, and he becomes rigid. And then the father says to Jesus that he brought his son to these disciples, but they couldn't cure him. So now Jesus knows exactly what the scribes and his disciples were fighting about. It was all about these disciples casting out this demon. And so then what Jesus does is he rebukes his disciples. And it seems like what he says seems really rough. "O faithless and perverse generations, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you?" So that seems harsh. And they probably, at this time, just seeing Jesus and having all these hard experiences, they probably would rather have had like a hug or an arm put around them, that Jesus would be understanding what they'd gone through. They probably weren't really thinking he was going to go and call them perverse. You know, they were probably thinking, well, maybe he'd say, "Well, good try, men." And so this rebuke must have been a little bit tough for him. But you have to remember with Jesus, even though he's direct, Jesus is never mean. And Jesus will explain this rebuke later. But now Jesus says, "Bring the boy to him." So in Mark, we're told that this demon had one last demonstration, and he acted out one last time before being cast out. And it's when that demon saw Jesus, and it says, immediately the spirit convulsed him and fell on the ground, and he wallowed, foaming at the mouth. And we're told, before he casts out the demon, we're told he asked the father a question. And he says, "How long has this been happening to him?" And then the father says, "From childhood." And so this demon has had control of this boy for a long time. And so we see again here, just like with the daughter of the Canaanite woman, that demons can affect children even from a young age. So now this father's life, it seems like it's been reduced to this being more of a caretaker. And that's because this boy, he can't be left alone, because this demon causes this boy to be suicidal. Because the father tells Jesus that these suicidal attempts, that they happen often. And he says, often he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. And I've heard a lot of good teachers like Chuck Swindoll say that suicidal tendencies are very much related to demonic activity. And this is not saying that anyone who has a suicidal thought is demon possessed, but that it's the natural tendency for humans to live, because we naturally, we fight to live. So thoughts of our own destruction, they don't originate from us. They originate from hell. So this father, he's been living this nightmare for a long time. And we're told in Mark that the father, he's on his knees and he's before Jesus. And I can imagine he's barely able to hold back these tears from streaming down his face. And then he asks Jesus, "But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus tells him, and he's trying to encourage him, he says, "If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes." And right here, we do know that this man started breaking down and crying, because it tells us that immediately he cried out with tears, "Lord, I do believe. Help me in my unbelief." And it never gets any more honest than that. And it's like us. We too, we usually often believe in God, but we also often wonder if he's willing to act in our circumstances, especially and mostly when our circumstances, when they've been going on for a long time, or maybe we've been in some kind of bondage for a long time, and we start to wonder if there's ever going to be any hope for us. Can Jesus deliver me from that? Or like here, we're holding out hope for somebody that we love, that they can be freed from their bondage. And so sometimes it seems like it's unreal, like a dream, like it could never happen. That if that would happen, it would be too good to be true. Because this man, he's been hoping for this for his son for a long time, just to have a normal boy, just to be able to sit with him in his right mind, like all the other boys. Maybe they could go fishing and maybe he wouldn't try to drown himself. Or maybe they could go camping and they could sit by a campfire without the boy jumping in it. And Jesus tells him, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. Well, what Jesus is not telling this man, he's not telling this man, well, if you have enough faith, your son can be delivered. That's not what Jesus is talking about. The belief that Jesus is talking about is believing not that his own faith has power to deliver his son, but his faith that Jesus can do these kind of things, and that Jesus has this kind of power to cast out the demon. So our believing is to be our faith placed in the person of Jesus. Because sometimes you'll hear people say, well, if you have enough faith, you can be healed. Or if somebody wasn't healed, they'll say, well, they weren't healed because they didn't have enough faith. That's bad theology. Because Jesus is going to tell us that it doesn't take much faith. It's all about where that faith is placed. That faith has to be placed in the person of Jesus. In Jesus himself, that he has the ability to do these things. And the truth is, this isn't even hard for Jesus. If you look here, Jesus, he only spoke one sentence, and he said, "Deaf and dumb spirit, I command you to come out of him and enter him no more." And then it was all over. And he may have been a deaf spirit, but that spirit sure did hear Jesus when he spoke. And that spirit, he cried out and he convulsed him greatly and he came out of him. And to be clear here, just because someone has epilepsy doesn't mean that he has a demon, because it's the same way that not everybody who's deaf has a demon. And I know a lot of dumb people, and a lot of people would say, I'm a dumb person, but dumb doesn't mean dumb. It means they can't speak, but not all dumb people have demons either. But I kind of do wonder about all those dumb people in Washington, if some of those guys have demons. But we're not going to go there. But what we learn here is that some demons do manifest these types of infirmities. Okay, so now these 9 disciples, they come to Jesus privately, and even though they've been rebuked by Jesus, they're not afraid to come to Jesus and to ask him why they couldn't cast the demon out. And what you have to remember here is that these disciples, they've been given Jesus's authority to cast out demons. And they've been casting out demons for a while now. They've been casting out demons since way back in chapter 10. And they're very surprised that they can't do it. And so they must have thought there must have been some kind of big reason. And they probably weren't sure why Jesus was so upset. And Jesus is telling them it's because of their unbelief. And then Jesus tells them they only needed a little faith, just the faith of a mustard seed. And so they had enough faith. They just weren't believing in Jesus's authority or his ability, because they already had Jesus's authority. These guys have never had any authority in themselves to be able to cast out demons. It's always been through Jesus's authority that they could do these things. And then Jesus, he gives us another insight here, that this kind of demon doesn't come out except by prayer and fasting, which kind of tells us that maybe these guys haven't been praying the way they should have been praying while Jesus has been gone for the last, 6 to 9 days. And with fasting, that implies that it would have taken time. And fasting would have been a physical act of faith, and it would have taken time, but that would show that they were actually believing that they could do this, or that Jesus could do this. And then Jesus, that word that he uses here for kind, about this kind, that's the word genos, which means this family of demons, this species or this race. So that tells us that there's different kinds of demons with different kinds of attributes. And just like the disciples, when we have a failure, and sometimes we too need to be corrected with a rebuke, and not just to be comforted in our failures, because that's not always the way it is to help us. But I would say that most of the time, Jesus, when we have some kind of failure, that he comes right alongside and he comforts us. But sometimes it takes a rebuke, and a rebuke is much more effective in making us the people that he's calling us to be, because Jesus is calling us to be a people of faith. All right, so now they're going back to Galilee, and Jesus is talking again about being killed and about his resurrection. Now, this is the very first time that Jesus mentions that he's going to be betrayed.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.